What a wonderful conference in a spectacular place, the most beautiful and challenging and amazing state I think I've ever been in. I love coming to Alaska, and I always make the mistake, it says it in the program, of not staying long enough. I always go, oh God, I want to leave. In fact, the best camping trip, vacation I ever did was kayaking 2 weeks on Glacier Bay out of Gustavus a couple years ago. I'm going to be talking about the fact that we're dreaming about a different future. We're having a nightmare right now of what the future will be like on a heating planet. And I will talk about the nightmare for the first 10 to 15 minutes or so. And then I'm going to talk about perhaps how we turn that nightmare into a positive dream. And people will say, this is impossible, it's not going to happen. Steve mentioned that I spent 10 years at CDC. I was the director of the National Center for Environmental Health. I had been in California for about 15 years, had done pesticides, air pollution, water, a whole series of issues, including infectious disease. I was a state epidemiologist. But over time, I was offered the job as the director at CDC. And I remember going and telling my wife, hey, I got this job at CDC, and we can move to Atlanta. And I said to our 3 sons, you know, if we move to Atlanta, you can have your own room. Because on a doctor's salary in Berkeley, all 3 were in 1 bedroom because we couldn't afford a bigger house. So we moved to Atlanta and arrived in 1994 in September, and it was 94 degrees and 94% humidity, and my sons decided I was clearly the stupidest man in the world. It turned out to be the greatest job anyone could ever have. I had the childhood lead poisoning program, the child asthma prevention program, the oversight of the destruction of the chemical weapons of the United States. And I was interfacing with the diabetes program and all the other programs at CDC, and I just loved it. So that's the picture of CDC headquarters now. But I began to think more and more about air pollution, and the more I thought about air pollution, I thought, yeah, it's a big driver of lung disease and respiratory disease in the United States, but the big driver of air pollution is how much we drive and how much time we spend in our cars and how little we produce locally and how we bring things from very far away. That's the big driver of air pollution. Gee, it's really land use and urban planning and transportation that's causing air pollution. You know, when I was about 10, showing my age here, they opened Disneyland, and all the kids in America in the mid-1950s turned on their black and white TVs and watched the opening of Disneyland. And it was really pretty cool because they had Tomorrowland and Fantasyland and Main Street USA. Only in America would people pay $28 to see people walk down an ordinary country street in a small town. But towards the end of this opening, the camera pans back, and you see Highway 5 in the distance, and you see the Magic Mountain of Disneyland in the distance. And over on Highway 5 is 5 cars. And it's a freeway. And everybody else in New Jersey probably looked at it and said, gee, they got free highways and there's only 5 cars on them. I'm going to move there. So California went from 10 million people to 40 million people, which is what we are now, since I was 10 years old. And America has doubled in population. It doesn't feel crowded yet to most people in Alaska, but much of the US feels this way. No meeting at UCLA starts without someone saying, I'm sorry I'm late, there was a crash on the Highway 5, or there was a crash on something or other, because we are confronting such degrees of density, in large part because we've built America to meet the needs of cars. And so we are confronted endlessly with the demands of automobiles. Cars were 25% of the GDP of the United States in the 20th century. And to meet the needs of cars, we paved over 60,000 square miles of the landmass of the continental US with highways and removed that much photosynthesis. It's the equivalent area of the state of Georgia. The equivalent area of the island of Puerto Rico is now surface-level parking lots to meet the needs of cars. So 1/6 of all the climate change we're looking at right now is due to deforestation. It's indirectly the result of fossil fuel burning because we're doing a lot of this deforestation to meet the needs of cars. We also did something else, which is we converted the best farmland you could imagine into subdivision after subdivision. So Orange County, California is called that because they had orange groves as far as you could see that did not need to be fertilized, did not need toxic chemicals, had deep roots that would go down far enough they didn't even need irrigation and water pulled in from far away. And that happened over and over again across the United States. My home state of New Jersey was called the Garden State because all the fruits and vegetables in eastern Pennsylvania and New York City came from New Jersey all summer long. Now, of course, it's completely paved over with subdivisions as well. So we think of that as just a trucking and domestic food issue, but it's an environment issue at the same time. This is a picture of the California state flower. It's not the forget-me-not. And it really is a metaphor for the fact that if people just got in cars, they could meet all their needs. And of course, everyone did, and it stopped meeting our needs. Cars have really become so much of a part of our DNA that we think it's normal that the leading cause of death in the United States between ages 3 and 34 is car crashes. And we have not reduced the absolute number of deaths in the United States from car crashes by any real degree, in part because we keep driving more. So even though the cars get safer, we're still killing roughly 35 to 40,000 people per year with cars. An enormous cost that we're paying. And we've changed how we live. So back in the 50s, when Leave It to Beaver was on television, kids walked to school. Every kid walked to school. They thought it was normal to, they didn't actually count it this way, to burn off 40,000 calories a year just walking back and forth to school. That's not a lot of body weight they could do at the same time. And so by changing the physical environment, we've become so car dependent that we've gone from 2/3 of kids walking and biking to school to about 1 in 8. Just in a generation or two. It's had a real influence on our children's weight, and it's also had an influence on their fitness, to the point now that 2 out of every volunteers for the US military, 2 out of every 7, I'm sorry, cannot get into the military because of obesity and lack of fitness. You've all seen the maps of the United States over time, but the average audience actually in America is shocking. 2/3 of the people in an audience, and I speak to architects and urban planners and builders all the time, have never seen the obesity maps of the US. So here's the latest one I could find. An average adult in America is about 25 pounds overweight. 1/3 of our population is obese, adult population. About 2/3 are over, including the obese, are overweight. The numbers are about half that percentages for children, but the trajectory is still going in the wrong direction. Lots of causes for it. We can talk about it later. You know that the increase in obesity is going to be associated with lots of other negative outcomes like bad joints and increasing rates of abdominal cancers, a series of other disorders. But the one thing we know for sure is if obesity goes up, type 2 diabetes is going to go up. So over that same period of time, about 20 years, we've doubled the rates of diabetes in the United States. And I know for indigenous peoples and people in certain parts of Alaska and elsewhere in the North America and the rest of the world, these rates are actually much, much worse. 2% of the entire GDP of the United States goes to the care of one disease, diabetes. And everybody my age in this room has lost friends to diabetes, has lost their eyes, their kidneys, their feet, and eventually their hearts to diabetes. So we're looking at tsunamis of chronic disease in our society, and we've got to begin to think about how do we turn down all the dials to make this better. I'm jumping a little more forward now, but this is a study that came out last year that just shocked me. So one of the things we do at CDC is we do the NHANES survey, and my center would do all the lab work for NHANES. We examined in blood samples and urine samples on 5,000 people a year, a very high-quality, robust sample of the American people. And so these researchers said, gee, well, let's compare the health of Americans 20 years ago under NHANES and these exams and what their health is like today. What do you think has happened? This, by the way, is the same age bracket, 20 different people, but 20 years, a stratified sample of the US. Overall health status, 20-year difference. NHANES 1990 to 2010. you think the people reporting excellent health went up or down? General US good statistical sample. Look at that. If people say, I have excellent health, it's a very good predictor of how long they're going to live. And to go from 32% to 13% in a highly robust sample is shocking. Can you go about your life, or do you need help? 9 to 14%. Do you need a wheelchair? Do you need a cane? Do you need some way to get around with your mobility? Look at that, more than a doubling of the percent of the US population. Go to Walmart and you believe it's true. You know that smoking and obesity, smoking went down, obesity went up, but this is the one that stuns me, and it's really at the core of what I want to talk about. For the last 40 years, we docs have been yelling at people saying, be physically active, walk more, bike more, do this, go to the gym, and look what's happened with physical activity in the United States. No physical activity from 17% to 50%. So where I'm going with this is, wagging our finger is a recipe for failure. We've got to figure out how to create environments that are irresistible to people in terms of physical activity. Combined with this decline of physical activity, and maybe in part caused by it, look at the change in the consumption of antidepressants by people in the prime of life in the United States. 4-fold increase. Well, gee, we'll all get healthier if we just spend more money. Nobody in this room is going to be fooled by that. We spent twice as, gone from 7% to 19% of the GDP being spent on medical care, and therefore we're the most healthy people in the world. Not quite. We have a life expectancy comparable to Slovenia. We're about number 47 worldwide, 49 worldwide. So throwing more money at this, and all the epidemiologists in the room know this, isn't going to work. We've got to really move upstream to intervene with disease. So it's this colossal perfect storm. We've got this chronic disease tsunami. We've got climate change that our sessions have been so focused on. I was born, the planet was 300 parts per million. The planet's now 400 parts per million. And I'm old, but I'm not geologically old. That's a big change. And I put this slide in because I have these brilliant experts on climate here, Chris Ebi, for example, and Kirk. This is this I resolved, and back in 2003, I resolved, after I had read the IPCC 2 or 3, I don't remember, I said, I'm never giving another talk without talking about climate change. And sometimes if I'm talking in some really redneck, tough part of the South, and I'm figuring I'm going to get lynched if I talk about climate change, I always show these slides. This is what we tell landscape gardeners where they can plant and what kind of trees they can plant. Here's the 1990 guidance on what trees to plant. And here's the 2006 guidance. There's nothing new since then, but I'm sure it's changed even upward. So Atlanta has become as hot as northern Florida. Nashville has become New York has become as hot as Atlanta in terms of what you plant over the course of 16 years. And as the native peoples that were speaking said, we knew this was going on. You scientists are pretty slow to catch on. And the landscape architects knew this was going on. So in 1999, I was driving to the director's office one day, and it finally hit me that as scientists, we are so reductionist. We keep picking little parts of the problem and we analyze them to death, but really we've got a systems problem here. And in large part, it's because of how we have built where we live. Yes, we got to change our diet and our advertising, but it's how we built where we live. So I wrote this paper with Chris Katisky in 2000 it was a thought piece, and it was published. And I said, I think we've legislated and taxed and did everything we could to put people in cars and make them more and more immobile, less physically active, more car dependent. And I thought everybody would say, God, he's really smart. And without exaggeration, a dozen members of Congress wrote to the head of CDC and said, fire that idiot Jackson. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's hostile to the American way. And Jeff Copeland called me in and said, Dick, you don't have much data. You shouldn't be saying all this. I said, I'm just thinking out loud. It's logical. If you make it impossible for somebody to get a carton of milk without getting in a car, they're really not going to walk enough. If you make it dangerous to bicycle, they're not going to bicycle. If you don't give them parks and places to go to, kids aren't going to be active. So I called up my friend Howie Frumkin. I said, Howie, we got to fix this. We got to really get people to think about built environment because it's such a big driver of our health. And he said, okay, Dick, I need a sabbatical, pay for my sabbatical. And we decided we had to do a bunch of things. One is we need more data and research and science. We need a corpus, of literature that really documented this. We needed, and boy, if you don't remember anything else, we needed a narrative. We needed a story that people could understand and remember. We had to convey that story with urgency and emotion, and we needed to create, and we epidemiologists and scientists are really good at this one, we needed to create a culture change, which is very hard for people like this. It may be easy for rock stars, but it's not easy for us. Nice thing about being at CDC is over the course of 50 weeks, we brought in 25 of the world's experts on planning, on landscape, on history of architecture, on and on and on. And we ended up pulling together an issue of the American Journal of Public Health completely devoted to the built environment and health. Actually, AJPH had done this before 100 years ago. Because 100 years before, everybody understood that where you lived and how you went about your lives was driving your health, but it hadn't been done in 100 years. And so it got very good traction. Howie was the lead, but we pulled together this book called Urban Sprawl and Public Health, and it was the beginning of the corpus. We had the literature there, and people could say, fire Dick Jackson, you didn't have any data. They couldn't say that anymore because the data was all pulled together in an orderly way with the graphs, charts, and data. We began to get partners in the public health world and the child health world, and the pediatricians were wonderful because they stepped up before anybody else, because pediatricians know that life is not a snapshot. Life is a movie, and you're looking at one frame, and you got to worry about where that whole movie is going when you see a child. And that's really what we're doing with climate change, is we're looking at a frame, and we need to look at the trajectory of that movie. So I began particularly to work with the American Institute of Architects, and we ran an event called Fit City, New York. And Mayor Bloomberg had his people there, and the mayor got this. He said, every kid lives near water ought to be able to go for a run. Every child ought to be able to go to the park. Every building ought to have pleasant and attractive stairways. Every building ought to be daylit. And this is the 100-page document that came out of the planning department for New York City for all new buildings. This is pretty radical because before that in New York, they wanted to tear out the steps in the Metropolitan Museum of Art and put escalators in, and suddenly they decided, no, people need to be walking upstairs. And it was a culture change, really. It was about people, not about machinery and efficiency. The medical associations began to embrace this, and this is Kaiser Permanente's campaign called Thrive. I'm sure they spent $1 million coming up for that one word to message the importance of people taking the stairs. I often joke that they clearly did this ad without ever talking to their safety people, but it really is a good message, and Kaiser's been wonderful in all of this. We convinced, and I was state health officer under Governor Schwarzenegger, we convinced every county health department to have somebody from the county health department go to the planning commission meetings, and for every county that had a master plan, a general plan, constitution for growth, to incorporate health elements all the way through that plan and to have a standalone health element. This really made health inescapable as they were making decisions about subdivision, school location, highways, and the rest. And I can remember a nurse saying to me, I was assigned to go to the planning commission meetings, and I got there, and there are all these, frankly, old white guys, and they said, there, dearie, what are you doing here? You don't know anything about shopping center positions. She goes, I know how kids can get back and forth to school and how they can get there, and I want to talk about crosswalks and sidewalks and how people get there. And over a course of 6 months, the planning commissioners got it. They began to say, well, of course you're right. And by the way, nurses have wonderful credibility, much more than doctors do. The other thing is people began to realize that they weren't very happy. And a lot of our young people, a lot of the millennials don't want to live in the typical subdivision we have built in the United States. In my video series, we were playing a little bit of it. We interviewed 8 girls in Smyrna, Georgia. And it's this typical subdivision where, you know, the only cultural outlet is the church or the shopping center. And the kids have to beg mom to take them absolutely everywhere. And every child growing up in suburbia in America uses the B word all the time. Anybody know what the B word is? It's not the one you think, it's boring. And a lot of these young people are now out of college or into their life careers, and they do not want to grow in a place that they're absolutely tied to their cars all the time. Cars cost about $10,000 easily a year. They'd rather be in a community that's walkable and bikeable, where their kids can have increasing autonomy. So over half the young people in America now want to buy into communities that are walkable, have access to parks. Frankly, are communities that would work very well in terms of sustainability and energy efficiency and less carbon footprint. If you're growing local fruits and vegetables and not eating ruminants, that's a good thing too. So then you have to create places that people would want to walk. Would you want to walk on a 3-story high railroad through lower Manhattan? Well, Mayor Bloomberg got behind, thank you. Mayor Bloomberg got behind taking the High Line through Lower East Side of Manhattan for about 25 blocks. It is now, the High Line is the 10th most visited tourist destination in the whole world. So people go to New York. No one would go to New York without going down to the High Line and walking the 20 blocks and seeing the Hudson and the Statue of Liberty and the Empire State Building and seeing all of Manhattan. That whole area now is completely revitalized because of this abandoned rail thing. One of the cool things about sustainability, Tony, is that the plants that are growing now that have been cultivated and growing all along the High Line in pots, basically, were the ones they took off that were volunteers growing out of the rusty old structure and then have been perfectly adapted, and they're doing very well there over time as well. I grew up going to New York at least twice a week, and if somebody had said to me, you'd be able to bicycle all the way around Manhattan, and they had said that to me 20 years ago, I would say, no, that's never going to happen. Average New Yorker bicycles around Manhattan and smiles a good part. If somebody said to me, New Yorkers going to smile all the time, I never would have believed it. So, you know, it's a big transition. This is a picture of Via Verde, and maybe it's a vision for people say, I don't like public housing. I don't like density. I want to have my own space. Via Verde holds 450 families. It's an old Superfund site. It's about 2 blocks from the subway. The designer made an extremely sustainable building. It has high energy efficiency, has an apple orchard on the roof, very good management, good gymnasia, 1/3 affordable housing, 1/3 workforce housing, which is a big need in New York, and 1/3 market rate housing, sold out in a week. People want to be in places if it's well designed, good sound, good safety, and good other kinds of issues. People want beauty, and so what they did in Indianapolis was put in a bike route, but they called it the Art Trail, and they got donors from the philanthropic world to pay for the art along the route. And even though the public health people and the lefties were all doing this for the bike route and socialization, it was also being done. They had to do a joint presentation together, and the young woman was doing a PhD in violence prevention, and the young man was doing his capstone in planning on transit-oriented development. They partnered for a presentation. He ended up completely redesigning the transit-oriented development because he wanted better sight lines, and she was pushing for that. And she began to realize, oh, how you design things really has a huge influence on violence prevention. And they got married. So I'm really very proud of that particular course. This is the companion book for my video series, and it's been shown in about 2 million homes, and it's not much of an impact. I wish it had a lot more impact, but I'm finding that people, it's becoming common sense that, oh, how you build really influences people's health. The importance of community. The community owns the Beltline in Atlanta, Georgia. It's not something being brought down from above. It's a demand coming from below. It's a linear park of about 30 miles. So finally, a bunch of funders asked the Institute of Medicine, National Academy of Sciences, how should we turn around the obesity epidemic? And what do you think the Institute of Medicine said? Goal number 1, recommendation 1, Communities, transportation officials, planners, health professionals, government should make promotion of physical activity a priority by increasing access to places and opportunities for it. That was number one. It wasn't get rid of high fructose corn sugar, which I would agree with too, but people need to have places that make them happy and active. So Andy and I and Howie did a paper 10 years after the issue we did of American Journal of Public Health. We looked at the entire world's literature on built environment and health for 10 years, English literature, 58 articles. In the prior, since that time, about 660 articles. So we have created the corpus. We've begun to create the culture change. It takes a lot of perseverance. It's almost as hard as doing an IPCC, but probably a lot more fun. And so here's a culture change. 3 years ago in Los Angeles, they shut down Wilshire Boulevard and said everybody could bicycle. And the police hated it, the retailers hated it, everybody hated it until they did it. And 250,000 people showed up and they were all smiling. And suddenly now the police department, the transportation department, the mayor, and everybody else are embracing a shutdown of one of the major highway streets, surface streets in Los Angeles about every 3 months. And it's creating a culture of bicycling in a place that really should have it. So here's physical environment. I believe that, by the way, every stream and river in the US ought to not only be swimmable and fishable, it ought to be bikeable, walkable. So here's the Chinoge Freeway, I'm not pronouncing it correctly, through downtown Seoul, South Korea. They ripped it out for a cost of $1 billion and exposed the underground river and planted it. You don't need to wag your finger at somebody and say, go for a walk. You don't need to tell the child to go outside if you give people places that are irresistible. So I just finished a big report because we're trying to do the same thing with the Los Angeles River for 55 plus miles, but it's a place that people want to be day and night. American Institute of Architects have embraced this, and they've actually made health, along with beauty and strength and utility, one of their touchstones for future buildings. So I hope they're never going to again build a building where you have to search for a stairway. It's going to be welcoming and pleasant when you walk in. U.S. Green Building Council, which you think of the LEED people, they have now made health on a par with sustainability, which is a big transition. I'm really pleased with this one. Our enemy, remember the people that wanted to get me fired, the the housing developers? This is their report, the Urban Land Institute, 10 Principles for Building Healthy Communities. Look at number 1, put people first. Who would think the greedy developers would say, put people first? And my favorite is, make healthy choices easy. So it is a culture change, but it takes perseverance, it takes the science, and it takes a narrative of health, happiness, and success. So with that, let me stop and thank you for inviting me to this wonderful conference.